A scream tore through the dark forest, sharp and sudden, cutting the silence like a blade. Elara froze mid-step, her basket of herbs slipping from her fingers and scattering across the wet leaves. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She had heard many sounds in these woods before: the howl of wolves, the cry of night birds, the rustle of foxes moving through the brush. But this sound was different. This was a man in pain, and he was close. She should have run. Every instinct told her to turn back toward the village, to bolt for the safety of her small cottage, and bar the door until morning. The forest at the edge of Draymore was forbidden after dark for good reason. Strange things happened here. Travelers vanished. Hunters spoke of shifting shadows that were not quite animal, and not quite man. But something in that scream held her in place, something raw and desperate that reached past her fear, and pulled at a part of her she did not fully understand. She moved toward the sound before she could stop herself. The moon was thin that night, barely a sliver behind drifting clouds, and the forest floor was a maze of black shapes and silver light. Elara stepped carefully, her breath fogging in the cold air, her hands trembling as she pushed aside low branches. The scream had faded into a ragged groan, and then into silence, which frightened her even more. Silence meant something had stopped fighting. She found him near the old stone creek, half submerged in the freezing water, his body twisted at an unnatural angle against the rocks. Blood soaked through his torn shirt, dark and glistening even in the poor light. His face was pale, his lips parted as if he had tried to speak and failed. For one terrible moment, Elara thought she was looking at a corpse. Then his chest rose. A shallow breath. He was alive, but barely. She dropped to her knees beside him without thinking, her hands hovering over his wounds, unsure where to even begin. There were gashes across his shoulder and side, deep and jagged, the kind that came from claws rather than blades. His skin burned with fever despite the icy water around him. Whatever attacked him had meant to kill him, and it had very nearly succeeded. "Can you hear me?" she whispered, leaning close. His eyes fluttered open for a heartbeat, gray and unfocused, before closing again. He did not answer. He could not answer. Elara knew she could not leave him there. The cold water would finish what his attacker had started, and even if she ran for help, no one would reach him in time. The village healer was an hour away on foot, and there was no guarantee anyone would risk the forest at night for a stranger. She was on her own. She grabbed him under the arms and pulled with all the strength she had. He was heavier than she expected, tall, and built with the kind of muscle that came from years of hard training, not farm work. Her boots slipped on the wet stones, and twice she nearly fell backward into the creek herself, but she kept pulling, dragging him inch by inch onto the muddy bank. By the time she got him fully out of the water, her arms burned, and her breath came in ragged gasps. She pressed her palm against the worst of his wounds, trying to slow the bleeding, and felt his heartbeat beneath her hand, weak but steady. Steady enough to give her hope. "Stay with me," she said, more to herself than to him. "Please stay with me." Her cottage was nearly a mile away, tucked at the edge of the village where the trees grew thickest, chosen for privacy rather than convenience. There was no way she could carry him that far alone. She thought of old Finch, who lived closer, but he was nearly 70 and would only slow her down. She thought of running for help and leaving the stranger behind, but something in her refused that option outright, as if leaving him now would be a betrayal she could not name. In the end, she found an old hunting trail that ran close to her home, one she had used 100 times gathering herbs, and she half carried, half dragged the wounded man along it, stopping every few minutes to catch her breath and check that he was still breathing. The journey took nearly 2 hours. By the time she reached her door, her arms had gone numb, and her dress was soaked through with mud, sweat, and his blood. She laid him on the floor before her hearth, kicking the door shut behind her, and immediately set to work building up the fire. Warmth first, she told herself, remembering the lessons her grandmother had taught her before she passed. Warmth first, then the bleeding, then the fever. In the firelight, she finally got a proper look at him. He was younger than she first thought, perhaps not much older than herself, with dark hair plastered to his forehead, and a jaw that even in unconsciousness looked carved from stone. His clothes, what remained of them, were finely made, far too fine for a hunter or a traveling merchant. A silver ring gleamed on his finger, etched with a symbol she did not recognize, a wolf's head circled by thorns. Whoever he was He was not a simple man. But questions could wait. Right now, he was dying in her home, and she refused to let that happen. She stripped away the ruined remains of his shirt and gasped softly at what she saw. The wounds were worse than she had realized in the dark forest. 4 long gashes raked across his shoulder and down his ribs, deep enough that she could see more than she wanted to. Whatever had attacked him had not been human. No blade left marks like that, claws, and large ones. Ilara forced herself to breathe evenly and think clearly. Panic would not help him. She had spent years assisting the village healer before the old woman's hands grew too unsteady for close work, and though Ilara had never treated wounds this severe, she remembered enough. She boiled water, gathered clean cloth, and pulled down the jars of herbs she kept stored along her shelf. Yarrow for the bleeding, comfrey for the healing, a tincture of willow bark for the fever that was already creeping into his skin. She worked through the night without rest. Cleaning the wounds made him groan and thrash weakly beneath her hands, and once his eyes opened again, glassy and unseeing, fixed on some point past her shoulder. "Hold still," she murmured gently, pressing a cloth soaked in yarrow tea against the worst of the gashes. "You are safe now. I promise you, you are safe." She did not know if he heard her. She did not know if he understood, but she kept talking anyway, low and steady, the way she had once talked to frightened animals caught in traps, because the sound of a calm voice seemed to matter, even when the words themselves did not. By the time gray light began creeping through her window, the bleeding had slowed to nothing, and his fever, though still high, no longer felt like it might consume him entirely. Ilara sat back on her heels, exhausted, her hands stained red, and studied the stranger's face in the pale morning light. "Who are you?" she wondered. "And what did this to you?" She thought of the whispers that sometimes drifted through the village, stories of a hidden kingdom deep in the northern hills, ruled by people who were not quite ordinary, people who could move like shadows and vanish into the trees. She had always dismissed them as tales meant to frighten children into staying close to home. Looking now at the wounds carved into this man's body, wounds no blade could have made, she was no longer so certain. Whatever he was, whoever he was, he needed her, and for reasons she could not fully explain, she found herself unwilling to let him go. He did not wake that first day, nor the second. Ilara moved him carefully onto her narrow bed, changed his bandages every few hours, and forced small amounts of broth and water past his lips whenever his breathing steadied enough to allow it. She barely slept, she barely ate. Her small cottage, usually so quiet, filled with the sound of his ragged breathing and her own quiet murmurs as she worked. On the third night, as she sat beside the bed changing the cloth on his shoulder, his hand suddenly shot up and closed around her wrist. Ilara gasped, nearly dropping the bowl of water in her lap. His eyes were open, sharper now than they had been, though still clouded with fever and pain. For a long moment, he simply stared at her, his grip tight, but not cruel, as though he were trying to determine whether she was real or another fevered dream. "Where?" he rasped, his voice rough from disuse. "Am I?" "You're safe," she said quickly, keeping her voice calm, despite the sudden hammering of her heart. "I found you in the forest. You were hurt very badly. I've been caring for you." His eyes searched her face, then flicked around the small room, taking in the low ceiling, the drying herbs hanging from the rafters, the single window shuttered against the night. Whatever he saw seemed to ease something in him, if only slightly, and his grip on her wrist loosened. "How long?" he asked. 3 days. He closed his eyes briefly, as though absorbing that information cost him effort. When he opened them again, there was something sharper there, something calculating beneath the exhaustion. "Is anyone else here?" "Did you tell anyone you found me?" The question caught her off guard. "No. No one knows. I live alone at the edge of the village. I haven't told a soul." Something like relief passed over his features, quickly hidden. "Good," he murmured. "Keep it that way." "You don't have to worry," she said gently, easing her wrist from his grip to press a cool cloth against his forehead. "You're not in any danger here." He gave a short, humorless breath that might have been a laugh under different circumstances. "You have no idea what kind of danger I might be in." Ilara paused, studying him. There was a weight behind his words, a warning wrapped in exhaustion, but she chose not to push. Whoever he was, Whatever had happened to him, he clearly was not ready to explain, and she was not about to demand answers from a man who had nearly died in her arms 3 nights ago. "You should rest," she said instead. "Whatever trouble follows you can wait until you're strong enough to face it." He studied her for a long moment, as if trying to understand why a stranger would show him such care, without asking a single question in return. "What's your name?" he finally asked. "Alara." "Alara," he repeated softly, as though testing the shape of it. "Thank you, Alara." "You should thank me by staying alive," she said, managing a small smile despite her exhaustion. "That was the deal I made with myself when I dragged you out of that creek." Something flickered across his face, something close to genuine amusement, and for a brief moment, the tension in the room eased. "I'll try to hold up my end," he said. "What should I call you?" she asked. He hesitated, just long enough for her to notice, and something in his eyes shifted, calculating and careful. "Rex," he said finally. It did not sound like a lie exactly, but it did not sound entirely true either. Alara let it pass without comment. She had bigger concerns than a stranger's name, namely keeping him alive long enough for it to matter. "Rest, Rex," she said, rising to fetch more broth. "We can talk more when you have the strength for it." He did not argue. Within minutes, exhaustion pulled him back under, though his breathing was steadier now, deeper, the breathing of a man who intended to survive, rather than one merely clinging to life. Alara watched him for a long while before returning to her chores, her mind turning over everything that had happened. The wounds that no ordinary weapon could cause, the silver ring with its wolf and thorns, the careful way he asked whether anyone knew he was here. She did not know what she had pulled from that creek, but she knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that her quiet life had already begun to change, and there was no pulling back from it now. Outside, far beyond the borders of Draymore, the forest stretched on toward hills that few villagers ever dared approach. Hills where old stories claimed a kingdom, hidden from ordinary eyes, had stood for generations, ruled by families with more than blood running through their veins. Somewhere in those hills, men were searching, quietly and urgently, for a king who had vanished without a trace, and they were searching in every direction, except the one that would have led them straight to him. Alara did not know any of this yet. She only knew that a wounded stranger lay sleeping in her bed, that his wounds spoke of danger she could not fully comprehend, and that despite every warning instinct telling her to be cautious, she found herself hoping he would wake again soon, if only so she could learn a little more about the man who called himself Rex. The fire crackled low in the hearth, as the night deepened around her small cottage, the only witness to a meeting that would, though neither of them yet understood it, reshape both of their lives entirely. She checked his bandages one final time, before finally allowing herself to rest, curling into the chair beside the bed, rather than leaving him alone. Sleep came slowly, pulled under by exhaustion, but even as her eyes closed, some part of her remained alert, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, as though it were the most important sound in the world. By morning, the worst of the danger had passed. His fever had broken sometime before dawn, leaving him drenched in sweat but breathing easily, his color returning bit by bit with each passing hour. Alara allowed herself a small measure of relief as she prepared a thin porridge, humming quietly to herself for the first time in days. She did not yet know his true name. She did not know he was a king, or that his kingdom believed him dead, or that the men who had attacked him were, even now, working to seize a throne that was not theirs to take. She knew only that a stranger had come into her life, in the most unexpected way, wounded and vulnerable, and that some quiet, stubborn part of her heart had already decided it would not let him go so easily. Whatever came next, she would face it. She always had. For now, though, there was broth to prepare, bandages to change, and a stranger's slow return to health to oversee. The rest of the world, with all its secrets and dangers, would simply have to wait its turn. Rex, as Alara had come to call him, woke fully 3 days later, sharper and more aware than he had been since she pulled him from the creek. He sat up slowly, wincing as the movement pulled at his healing wounds, and looked around the small cottage with new eyes, taking in every detail he had missed while half-conscious with fever. The room was simple but not poor. Dried herbs hung from the ceiling beams in neat bundles, their scent mixing earthy and sharp. Shelves lined one wall, crowded with jars of tinctures, salves, and dried roots, each labeled in careful handwriting. A single window let in pale morning light, and a small fire crackled in the stone hearth, keeping the chill of early spring at bay. It was the home of someone who worked with her hands and knew exactly what she was doing. Elara herself was outside gathering water when he woke, and by the time she returned, bucket in hand, she found him sitting upright, studying his bandaged shoulder with a critical eye. "You shouldn't be moving so much," she said, setting the bucket down and crossing to check his wounds. "You'll tear the stitches." "I've had worse," he said, though the words came out quieter than he intended, more admission than boast. "I doubt that," she replied, gently probing the edges of the wound. "Whatever did this to you meant to kill you. You're lucky to be breathing at all." He said nothing to that, but something tightened behind his eyes, a flash of memory he clearly did not want to revisit. Elara noticed, but did not press. She had learned over the past days that pushing him only made him retreat further into silence. "How do you feel?" she asked instead, changing the bandage with practiced hands. "Better than I should," he admitted. "You're skilled at this. I learned from the village healer. She's getting old now, and her hands shake too much for close work, so I do most of it these days." Elara tied off the fresh bandage and sat back. "You're healing faster than I expected, honestly. Whatever you're made of, it's sturdy." Something flickered in his expression, amusement mixed with caution, as though her words had landed closer to truth than she realized. "Maybe I just had a good healer." She smiled slightly at that, the first real smile she had allowed herself in days. "Well, don't test her patience by tearing your stitches open again." Over the following hours, as she moved about the cottage tending to chores, they fell into an easy rhythm of conversation, careful at first, then gradually more open. She told him about the village, about growing up the daughter of a woodcutter who had died when she was young, about the grandmother who raised her and taught her the ways of herbs and healing before passing several winters ago. She spoke of her quiet life on the edge of Draymore, content mostly with solitude, trusted by the villagers for her skills, but never quite one of them, always a little apart. He listened more than he spoke, asking careful questions that revealed genuine interest rather than idle curiosity. When she asked about him in return, he offered pieces, small and guarded, never quite forming a complete picture. He spoke of traveling often, of responsibilities that weighed heavily, of a family situation complicated enough that he preferred not to discuss it in detail. He never once mentioned a kingdom, a crown, or a name beyond the one he had already given her. Elara noticed the gaps in his story, the careful way he steered conversations away from specifics, but she found she did not mind as much as she probably should have. There was something in the way he watched her, attentive and quietly grateful, that made the mystery feel less like a warning and more like an invitation to patience. "You didn't have to help me," he said one evening, as she sat mending a torn shirt by the fire's light. "You could have left me there. Most people would have." "I couldn't do that," she said simply, not looking up from her work. "Why not?" She considered the question seriously before answering. "Because you needed help, and I was able to give it. That's not something I could walk away from, even if it meant putting myself at risk." "That's a dangerous way to live," he said quietly, "trusting strangers in the dark." "Maybe," she agreed. "But it's who I am. I'd rather live with an open hand than a closed fist, even if it costs me sometimes." He watched her for a long moment, something unreadable in his gray eyes, and when he spoke again, his voice had softened into something almost reverent. "I don't think I've met anyone quite like you." Elara felt heat rise in her cheeks and busied herself with the mending to hide it. "You've probably met plenty of people. You just don't remember them clearly. What with the fever and the near dying." "No," he said, and there was no humor in it now, only quiet certainty. "I would remember someone like you." The words settled between them, heavier than either had intended, and for a moment neither spoke, the fire crackling softly in the silence. Elara finally looked up, meeting his gaze, and found something there that made her breath catch, something intense and searching, as though he were trying to memorize every detail of her face. "You should rest," she said finally, breaking the moment, before it could grow into something neither of them was prepared for. "Tomorrow will bring more healing to do." He nodded slowly, though his eyes lingered on her a moment longer, before he settled back against the pillows she had arranged for him. "Good night, Alara." "Good night, Rex." She retreated to her chair by the fire, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders, but sleep did not come easily that night. Her mind kept replaying the way he had looked at her, the weight of his words, the strange pull she felt toward a man whose true identity remained hidden behind careful half-truths. She told herself it did not matter who he truly was. He was healing, he was grateful, and soon enough, he would be strong enough to leave and return to whatever life waited for him beyond the forest. Whatever connection had sparked between them during these strange, quiet days would fade once he was gone, as such things often did. But even as she thought it, some quiet part of her did not quite believe it. The days that followed brought steady improvement. Rex grew stronger with each passing morning, able to sit up longer, then to stand, then to take slow, careful steps around the small cottage while leaning on the wall for support. His appetite returned in full, and Alara found herself preparing larger meals, secretly pleased each time he finished every bite, and asked, almost sheepishly, if there was more. He began helping with small tasks, despite her protests, stacking firewood with his good arm, mending a loose hinge on her door, tasks that required little strength but seemed to ease some restlessness in him, as though sitting idle for too long grated against his nature. Alara watched him work with quiet amusement, noting the careful, efficient way he moved, even while injured, the awareness he seemed to carry of his surroundings at all times, always positioned where he could see the door, always listening to sounds beyond the cottage walls. He was hiding something significant, she was certain of that now, but whatever it was, it did not frighten her. If anything, the mystery of him only deepened her curiosity, and beneath that curiosity, something warmer had begun to grow, something she was not yet ready to name. One afternoon, as she returned from checking her herb garden, she found him standing at the window, staring out toward the tree line, with an expression of such focused intensity that she paused in the doorway, unwilling to disturb him. "Is something wrong?" she finally asked. He turned quickly, and for a brief moment, she caught something in his eyes, not quite fear but close to it, a wariness that spoke of threats she could not see. Then it smoothed away, replaced by his usual careful composure. "Just thinking," he said, "about things I need to attend to soon." "Whatever it is, it can wait a little longer," she said, setting down her basket. "You're not strong enough to leave yet." "I know." He crossed the room slowly, favoring his healing side, and settled into the chair by the fire. "But time is not something I have unlimited amounts of. There are people who need me, and every day I remain hidden. Things grow more complicated." Alara sat across from him, studying his troubled expression. "You could tell me what's wrong. I might be able to help." He was quiet for a long moment, weighing something behind his careful eyes. "It's complicated in ways that would be hard to explain," he said finally, "and dangerous. I don't want to put you at risk by telling you more than you already know. I found you nearly dead in the forest, and dragged you a mile through the mud in the middle of the night," she pointed out dryly. "I think I've already proven I can handle some risk." Something like a real laugh escaped him then, brief but genuine. "Fair point." His expression sobered quickly though, and he leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Just trust me when I say that the less you know right now, the safer you'll be. When the time is right, I promise I'll explain everything." Alara wanted to push further, wanted to demand the truth he was so carefully withholding, but something in his eyes stopped her, a quiet plea beneath the careful words. Whatever burden he carried, it clearly weighed on him deeply, and pressing him now would only add to that weight without truly helping. "All right," she said softly, "I'll trust you. But when you're strong enough to face whatever's waiting for you, I hope you'll remember that promise." "I will," he said, and something in his voice carried a weight of sincerity that settled warmly in her chest. "I won't forget any of this, Alara. Not what you did for me, and not the promise I just made." The fire popped softly in the silence that followed, and outside, the wind moved gently through the trees, carrying with it the scent of approaching rain. Neither of them spoke again for a long while, content simply to sit together in the quiet warmth of the cottage, two people bound together by circumstance, and something neither was quite ready to define, while beyond the forest's edge, A kingdom continued searching in vain for a king they believed had vanished forever. A week into his recovery, Rex could walk the length of the cottage without pain, and the wounds along his shoulder and ribs had closed into thin pink lines that would soon fade to nothing more than faint scars. Alara marveled quietly at how quickly he healed, far faster than any patient she had ever treated. But she kept her observations to herself, sensing that questions about his nature were still unwelcome. Instead, she focused on the growing ease between them, the comfortable rhythm of shared meals and quiet evenings by the fire. She learned that he had a sharp, dry sense of humor that emerged more freely as his strength returned, and that he listened with genuine attention whenever she spoke, remembering small details from days before, and bringing them up again with a thoughtfulness that surprised her. He learned, in turn, that she was stubborn in ways that amused him, insisting on doing chores herself, even when he offered to help, refusing to let him overexert his healing body, no matter how he protested. He learned that she hummed softly while she worked, an old tune her grandmother used to sing, and that she laughed easily when he teased her about it, though she always denied doing it at all. "You're humming again," he said one morning, watching her stir a pot of porridge over the fire. "I am not," she said, without pausing the tune. "You are. You do it every morning while you cook. It's a nice sound." She glanced back at him, catching the small smile playing at the corner of his mouth, and felt her own lips curve in response despite herself. "Maybe I hum, because I'm trying to drown out the sound of you complaining about the porridge. I've never complained about the porridge. You make a face every single time," she said, turning back to stir the pot, like a man being forced to eat something offensive. "It's simple food," he admitted. "I'm used to different." The comment slipped out before he seemed to fully consider it, and Alara noticed the way his expression shifted immediately after, as though he regretted the accidental hint at a life far grander than the one he was currently living in her small cottage. She chose not to comment on it, filing the detail away with the others she had already gathered, pieces of a puzzle she was slowly assembling despite his careful efforts to keep the picture hidden. As the days passed, their conversations grew deeper, moving beyond simple pleasantries into questions that mattered more. He asked about her dreams, what she hoped for beyond the quiet life of Draymore, and she found herself admitting things she had never spoken aloud to anyone, a quiet longing to see more of the world beyond the forest, a hope that her life held more purpose than simply surviving day to day. "You could have that," he said one evening, his voice quiet and serious. "You're capable of far more than this village allows you to show." "It's not so simple," she said, though something in his conviction warmed her more than she wanted to admit. "This is my home. My grandmother is buried here. My whole life is here." "A life can grow," he said. "It doesn't have to stay small just because it started that way." She looked at him then, really looked, and saw something in his gray eyes that felt like a promise, though neither of them spoke it aloud. Whatever separated them, whatever secrets he still carried, in that moment, it felt distant and unimportant compared to the quiet understanding passing between them. "What about you?" she asked softly. "What do you hope for, beyond healing and returning to whatever waits for you?" He was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tightening slightly as he considered the question. "I used to think I knew exactly what I wanted," he said finally. "Duty, purpose, the responsibilities I was raised to carry. It seemed clear enough." He paused, glancing at her with an expression she could not quite read. "Lately I'm not so certain anymore. Something has shifted, and I find myself wanting things I never expected to want." "Like what?" He held her gaze steadily. "Like more time in a small cottage at the edge of a forest, with someone who never once asked me to be anything other than exactly who I am." Alara's breath caught, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the space between them charged with something neither was ready to name outright. She was the one who finally looked away, busying herself with the fire to hide the flush rising in her cheeks, though the warmth of his words lingered long after the moment passed. That night, as she lay awake in her chair by the fire, she found herself thinking not of the mystery surrounding him, but of the quiet ache growing in her chest, the fear of what would happen once he was strong enough to leave. Whoever he truly was, whatever life waited for him beyond the forest, she knew instinctively that it was a life far removed from her own simple existence, and the thought of him disappearing back into that unknown world left her with a hollow feeling she did not know how to address. She told herself she was being foolish, allowing herself to grow attached to a man whose very name remained a mystery, whose past was carefully guarded, whose future almost certainly held no place for a healer's granddaughter from a small forest village. But even as she reasoned with herself, her heart refused to listen, already tangled in something far deeper than she had intended to allow. The following morning brought an unexpected disruption to their quiet routine. Elara had gone out early to check her snares, hoping for fresh meat to supplement their dwindling supplies, when she heard voices carrying faintly through the trees, unfamiliar and distant but unmistakably present. She froze, crouching low behind a cluster of bushes, straining to make out the words. Search wider, the trail went cold near the eastern ridge. The king wouldn't have survived this long without aid. Someone must be hiding him. Her heart pounded as the words settled into meaning. The king. They were searching for a king, and based on the direction of the voices, they were searching in these very woods, close enough to her cottage that discovery felt suddenly, terrifyingly possible. She waited, frozen and silent, until the voices faded into the distance, then rose slowly and made her way back home, as quickly as she dared, without breaking into a run that might draw attention. By the time she reached her cottage, her hands were trembling, and she burst through the door with far less caution than usual. Rex looked up sharply from where he sat by the fire, immediately reading the alarm on her face. What happened? There were men in the forest, she said breathlessly, searching for someone. They mentioned a king. His entire demeanor shifted instantly, the careful ease of the past days vanishing into something sharp and alert, every muscle tensed as though preparing for a threat. How close were they? Close enough that I could hear them clearly. Maybe half a mile from here, moving east. She studied his reaction carefully, the tension radiating from him now impossible to ignore. Rex, who are you? Please, I need to know if we're in danger. He closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again, something had settled behind his gaze. A decision made. Sit down, he said quietly. I think it's time I told you the truth. Elara's heart hammered as she lowered herself into the chair across from him, sensing that whatever came next would change everything between them, and there would be no going back once the words were spoken. My name isn't Rex, he began, his voice steady, despite the weight of what he was about to reveal. It's Kale, and the men searching this forest are looking for me, because I am the Alpha King of the Northlands, ruler of a kingdom hidden beyond these hills, a kingdom of people who are not entirely what they appear to be. Elara sat perfectly still, absorbing the words, her mind racing to reconcile the quiet, wounded stranger she had nursed back to health with the title he had just claimed. A king, she repeated slowly. You've been a king this whole time, and you told me your name was Rex. I had to be careful, he said. When you found me, I didn't know who had attacked me or why. For all I knew, whoever tried to kill me had allies everywhere, even in a small village like Draymore. I couldn't risk revealing my identity to a stranger, no matter how kind she had been. What happened to you? She asked, her voice quieter now, the shock giving way to genuine concern. Who attacked you like that? Kale's expression darkened, old anger surfacing beneath the careful composure he usually maintained. Members of my own council, he said. Men I trusted, men who served beside me for years. They grew tired of waiting for power that wasn't theirs to claim, and they arranged an ambush deep in the forest, far from my guards, where they hoped my death would look like the work of rival packs rather than betrayal from within. That's horrible, Elara whispered. It very nearly worked, he said grimly. If you hadn't found me when you did, I would have died in that creek, and they would have declared themselves victors of a war I never knew I was fighting. He met her eyes, something raw and grateful in his expression. You saved far more than my life, Elara. You saved my entire kingdom from falling into the hands of men who would have torn it apart for their own gain. She absorbed this slowly, pieces falling into place, the silver ring with its wolf and thorns, the wounds no ordinary weapon could cause, the careful, wary way he had watched every door and window since regaining consciousness. The wounds, she said slowly, they weren't from a blade. No, he confirmed. My attackers are like me, not entirely human. We call ourselves shifters, though the old stories your people tell probably use less flattering terms. My kingdom exists hidden from the wider world, protected by generations of careful secrecy, and those who attacked me, used that same nature against me, hoping the wounds would look like the work of wild animals, rather than deliberate betrayal. Ilara studied him now with new eyes, searching for some outward sign of the nature he claimed, though she found nothing beyond the man she had already come to know, tired and earnest, and carrying a weight far heavier than she had initially understood. She asked finally, though the question came without real fear behind it, more curiosity than concern. "Not to you," he said immediately, firmly. "Never to you." Something in the certainty of his answer settled the last of her unease, and she found herself nodding slowly, accepting the impossible truth he had just laid before her. "What happens now?" she asked. "Those men were searching this forest. If they find you here—" "They can't," he said, his jaw tightening. "Not yet. I'm strong enough to defend myself if it comes to that, but I'm not yet strong enough to reclaim my throne, and if my betrayers find me before I'm ready, they'll finish what they started." "Then you need to stay hidden longer," Ilara said, practical concern overriding the lingering shock of his revelation. "Whatever strength you still need to regain, you can find it here. I'll make sure no one discovers you." Kale reached across the space between them and took her hand, his grip warm and steady. "You've already risked so much for a stranger," he said quietly. "I can't ask you to risk more. Not now that you know exactly what kind of danger surrounds me." "You're not asking," she said, meeting his gaze evenly. "I'm offering. There's a difference." Something shifted in his expression, gratitude mixing with an emotion far deeper, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the quiet cottage holding the weight of everything that had just passed between them. Finally, he lifted her hand and pressed his lips gently against her knuckles, a gesture so unexpectedly tender that her breath caught in her throat. "Thank you," he murmured against her skin. "I don't know how I'll ever repay what you've done for me." "You don't need to repay anything," she said softly. "Just survive this. Reclaim what's yours. That's all the thanks I need." The days that followed carried a different weight than before, the easy comfort of their earlier routine, now shadowed by the constant awareness of danger lurking beyond the cottage walls. Kale grew more cautious, listening carefully to every sound outside, positioning himself near windows and doors with a wariness that spoke of a man accustomed to threats. Ilara adjusted her own habits as well, checking the forest more carefully before venturing out, keeping her steps quiet and her senses alert for any sign of searching parties. Despite the tension, their bond continued to deepen. Kale spoke more openly now that his secret was revealed, sharing details of his kingdom, the responsibilities he carried, the weight of ruling people who depended on him for protection and guidance. Ilara listened with genuine fascination, asking questions about the hidden world he described, a place of ancient traditions and careful balance between human appearance and shifter nature. "Tell me about your kingdom," she said one evening, curled in her chair while he sat across from her, his strength nearly fully restored now, though he had made no move yet to leave. "What's it like?" "Beautiful," he said, a faraway look entering his eyes. "Built into the hills, hidden by old magic our ancestors wove generations ago. The buildings are carved from the same stone as the mountains themselves, and the forest around it is alive with more than ordinary wildlife. My people live much like yours, farming and trading and raising families, but beneath the surface, we carry a strength your people don't possess. Do you miss it?" "Every day I've been here," he admitted, "but I don't regret the time. If I had returned immediately after healing enough to walk, I would have marched straight into a trap my betrayers had surely prepared, expecting me to rush back before I was ready. This delay, this time to fully recover and think clearly, may well be the reason I survive what comes next." Ilara nodded slowly, though a quiet ache settled in her chest at the reminder that his time in her cottage, however meaningful it had become to her, was always meant to be temporary. "When will you be ready?" she asked, keeping her voice carefully neutral. Kale studied her for a long moment before answering, and when he spoke, his voice carried a gentleness that suggested he understood exactly what she was truly asking. "Soon," he said. "Days, not weeks. But Ilara, when I leave, I don't intend for this to be goodbye." "You have a kingdom to reclaim," she said quietly, "a council to overthrow, enemies to defeat. Whatever this has been between us, I understand it can't simply continue once you return to that life." "You don't understand," he said, leaning forward, his gray eyes intense and certain. I don't know exactly how things will unfold once I return, or how long it will take to secure my throne and root out every traitor among my council. But I know this much with absolute certainty. I am not leaving you behind, Alara. Whatever it takes, whatever obstacles stand between us, I intend to return for you." The words settled over her like a promise too large to fully comprehend, and she found herself searching his face for any hint of doubt, finding none. "Chaol," she whispered, his true name feeling strange and significant on her tongue for the first time. "You barely know me. A few weeks in a cottage during your recovery isn't enough to build a future on." "It's enough for me," he said simply. "I've ruled a kingdom since I was young, surrounded by people who wanted things from me, who saw only the crown and never the man beneath it. You saved my life without knowing who I was, cared for me without expecting anything in return, and challenged me, comforted me, and made me laugh more in these few weeks than I can remember laughing in years. That's not nothing, Alara. That's everything." She felt tears prick at her eyes, overwhelmed by the sincerity in his words, and though caution urged her to guard her heart against a promise that might prove impossible to keep, she found herself unable to resist the pull toward him any longer. "I don't know what to say," she admitted softly. "You don't have to say anything," he said, reaching for her hand once more. "Just know that whatever happens next, whatever battles I face reclaiming my throne, you will remain in my thoughts every single moment until I can return and prove that this promise was never empty words." Outside, the wind stirred through the trees, carrying with it the distant, ever-present threat of searching enemies. But within the small cottage, wrapped in firelight and quiet certainty, Alara allowed herself, for the first time, to believe that whatever came next might truly lead somewhere worth hoping for. While Chaol healed in the quiet safety of Alara's cottage, the kingdom he ruled had begun to unravel without him. In the great stone hall built into the northern hills, a man named Garrick sat in the high seat that was not his own, his fingers drumming against the carved armrest as he addressed the gathered council with practiced calm. "The king's trail has gone cold," he announced, his voice carrying easily through the hall, despite its false note of regret. "It has been weeks now. We must accept the difficult truth that our beloved King Chaol likely did not survive the attack that separated him from his guard." Murmurs rippled through the assembled council members, some genuine in their grief, others carefully hiding relief or ambition behind practiced expressions. Garrick had spent years cultivating alliances among the more discontented members of the court, promising positions of greater power once the old order gave way to something new, something he intended to control entirely. "We cannot leave the throne empty indefinitely," he continued, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. "The kingdom needs stability, especially now, with rival pacts sensing weakness at our borders. I propose a temporary council leadership to guide our people until a proper successor can be determined." A woman near the back of the hall rose slowly, her expression skeptical. Her name was Bramwell, one of the few council members Garrick had not managed to sway to his cause, and her sharp eyes studied him with open suspicion. "Temporary leadership, determined by whom, Garrick? You speak as though the decision has already been made, when the king's own guard has not yet declared him officially dead." "The guard search continues," Garrick said smoothly, "but we must be realistic. No one survives weeks in that forest, with the wounds our reports describe. I merely wish to prevent chaos while we mourn, nothing more." Bramwell's eyes narrowed further, but she said nothing more in the open hall, choosing instead to retake her seat and observe the proceedings with careful attention. She had served the royal family for decades, had watched Chaol grow from a young heir into a capable, respected king, and something about Garrick's eagerness to fill the empty throne struck her as deeply wrong. After the council session ended, she sought out Captain Ronan, the head of the king's personal guard. Finding him in the training yard, overseeing a group of soldiers still combing the surrounding territories for any sign of their missing king. "Garrick grows bolder," she said without preamble, falling into step beside him as he walked the perimeter of the yard. "He proposed temporary leadership today, practically declaring the king dead before we found so much as a body." Ronan's jaw tightened, a muscle flexing beneath his weathered skin. "I don't believe the king is dead," he said quietly. "The attack was too clean, too convenient. Someone orchestrated it, and I have my suspicions who." "You think Garrick was involved?" "I think it's no coincidence," that the king vanished shortly after Garrick began pushing for changes to trade agreements that would have stripped power from the crown and redistributed it among the council, Ronan said grimly. I think it's no coincidence that the guards assigned to the king's escort that day were reassigned at the last moment, replaced by soldiers loyal to Garrick's faction. Bramwell absorbed this, her expression darkening. If you're right, and Garrick did orchestrate this, we're running out of time to stop him. Every day the throne remains empty. His position grows stronger. Then we keep searching, Ronan said firmly. And we keep our suspicions quiet until we have proof. If Garrick suspects we're onto him, he'll move against us before we can act. The search parties combing the forest had in fact been working under Garrick's careful direction, though their orders were subtly different from what the council believed. Rather than searching to find and rescue their missing king, the soldiers loyal to Garrick's cause had been instructed to search for confirmation of death, to find any sign of the king's fate that could be used to solidify the narrative Garrick wished to establish. Unfortunately for Garrick's plans, loyal soldiers like Ronan had also joined the search efforts, genuinely hoping to find their king alive, and it was this divided search, some hunting for proof of death while others hunted for hope of survival, that had brought voices dangerously close to Alara's cottage that fateful morning. Ronan himself led one such search party through the eastern edge of the forest, close enough to Draymore that his soldiers occasionally passed near the village outskirts. He studied the terrain carefully as they moved, noting details his men often missed, broken branches at heights consistent with an injured man moving carefully, rather than fleeing in panic, faint impressions in soft earth that suggested someone had been dragged rather than walked willingly. Someone came this way, he murmured to himself, crouching to examine a partially healed scuff mark on a fallen log, and someone else helped them. His second in command, a younger soldier named Colm, knelt beside him, studying the same marks. You think the king came through here, sir? I think someone injured came through here, Ronan said carefully, unwilling to voice his hopes too openly, even among trusted soldiers. Whether it was the king himself, we can't be certain yet. But this trail leads toward the village. We should investigate further. They followed the faint signs for another hour, before the trail grew too faint to track with certainty, the forest floor too dense with fallen leaves and new growth to preserve clear markings any longer. Ronan called a halt to the search as evening approached, promising his men they would return to continue the investigation, though something in his gut told him the trail's direction, straight toward the edge of Draymore village, carried real significance. He did not know, as he made camp that night with his search party, that he had come within a half-mile of the very cottage sheltering his missing king. He did not know that the voices his men had raised while discussing the search, voices that carried through the still forest air, had reached the ears of the woman currently hiding that king from the very enemies Ronan himself was trying to expose. Back in Draymore, Alara moved through her days with new caution, aware now that the danger surrounding Kale was not merely theoretical, but actively searching the very forest surrounding her home. She varied her routes when gathering herbs, avoided drawing unnecessary attention from neighbors, who might notice her frequent trips to the market for supplies far beyond what a single woman living alone typically required, and kept her ears constantly attuned to any unusual activity in the village. The village itself had begun to notice her strange behavior, subtle though it was. Mira, a young woman Ilara had known since childhood, and one of her few close friends in Draymore, cornered her outside the market one afternoon, her expression a mixture of curiosity and concern. You've been different lately, Mira observed, falling into step beside her as Ilara carried a basket heavy with supplies. Distracted. And you're buying enough food to feed 3 people, though you live alone. Ilara forced a casual smile, keeping her voice light despite the sudden spike of anxiety in her chest. I've been experimenting with new recipes, trying to use up the extra herbs before they spoil. Mira's raised eyebrow suggested she was not entirely convinced, but she did not press further, instead linking her arm through Ilara's as they walked. Well, whatever you're up to, you know you can tell me if something's wrong. We've been friends since we were children, Ilara. You don't have to carry burdens alone. Guilt tugged at Ilara's chest, knowing she was deceiving one of the few people she trusted completely, but she could not risk revealing Kale's secret, not even to Mira. I know, she said instead, squeezing her friend's arm gently. Thank you, truly, but everything is fine, I promise. I've just been tired lately, that's all. Mira studied her for a long moment before nodding, letting the subject drop, though the concerned crease between her brows suggested the matter was not entirely forgotten. They parted ways near the village square, and Alara hurried home with her supplies, grateful to escape further questions, though the encounter left her unsettled, a reminder that maintaining secrecy grew more difficult with each passing day. That evening, as she prepared dinner, she relayed the encounter to Kale, who listened with a troubled expression. "You shouldn't have to lie to your friends because of me," he said quietly. "I've already asked so much of you." "It's fine," she reassured him, though the weariness in her voice suggested otherwise. "Mira is understanding. She won't push further." "For now," Kale said. "But eventually, questions will demand answers, and I don't want you caught in a web of lies on my behalf." He paused, something resolute settling into his expression. "I need to move faster than I planned. My strength has returned enough that further delay only increases risk, both to you and to my kingdom's stability." Alara's heart sank at his words, though she had known this moment was approaching. "When will you leave?" "Soon," he said. "Within the next few days. I need to reach my most trusted allies before Garrick, if he's truly behind this betrayal, solidifies his hold on the council entirely." "How will you get past the search parties safely? They're already close, Kale. If they find you before you've reached your allies." "I'll be careful," he said, though the promise did little to ease the fear tightening in her chest. "I know these forests better than any soldier searching for me. I grew up learning every hidden path and secret trail through these hills." Alara nodded slowly, though worry gnawed at her regardless of his confidence. The thought of him leaving, of facing enemies who had already nearly killed him once, filled her with a dread she had not expected to feel so intensely. Somewhere along the way, without quite realizing when it happened, her concern for a wounded stranger had transformed into something far deeper, something that made the thought of losing him unbearable. "Promise me you'll be careful," she said softly, reaching for his hand across the table. "Promise me this isn't the last time I'll see you." Kale's expression softened, and he lifted her hand to press a gentle kiss against her knuckles, his gray eyes holding hers with unwavering certainty. "I promise," he said. "This is not goodbye, Alara. Whatever happens in the days ahead, I will find my way back to you, or I will send for you the moment it's safe to do so. That is a promise I intend to keep, no matter what obstacles stand in my way." She wanted desperately to believe him, and in the warmth of his steady gaze, she found herself doing exactly that, even as fear for his safety continued to churn beneath the surface of her hope. Outside, the forest remained restless with searching soldiers, and somewhere in the northern hills, a traitor sat upon a throne that was not his own, unaware that the king he believed dead was, even now, preparing to reclaim everything that had been stolen from him. 2 more days passed before Kale declared himself ready to leave, and in that short span, Alara found herself memorizing every detail of him, as though preparing for a loss, rather than a temporary parting. The way his laughter softened the sharp lines of his face. The careful attention he gave whenever she spoke, as though her words carried more weight than anyone else's ever had. The quiet strength he carried even in stillness, a steadiness that had first drawn her to save him, and now made the thought of his absence feel unbearable. On his final evening in the cottage, they sat together by the fire, long after the meal had been cleared away, neither quite ready to acknowledge that morning would bring their separation. Kale had regained most of his former strength now, his movements no longer careful and guarded but confident, powerful even, a glimpse of the formidable king he must have been before the attack that brought him to her door. "I keep thinking about how strange this all is," Alara admitted, watching the flames dance in the hearth. "A few weeks ago my life was simple, herbs, healing, quiet days in this cottage. Now, I'm sitting across from a king, about to send him off to reclaim a throne from traitors who tried to kill him." "Do you regret it?" Kale asked, watching her carefully. "Any of it?" "No," she said immediately, without hesitation. "Not for a single moment. I just wish the path forward were simpler." "So do I," he admitted. "If circumstances were different, I would stay here as long as you'd have me, content with this quiet life and nothing more. But my people need me, Alara. I can't abandon them to Garrick's greed, not when I have the strength to stop him." "I understand," she said softly. "I would think less of you if you chose otherwise." He reached across the space between them and took her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles against her palm. "There's something I need to ask you," he said, his voice carrying unusual hesitation for a man normally so certain in his words. "Once I've reclaimed my throne and secured my kingdom against further betrayal, I intend to send for you, to bring you to my kingdom, properly, as more than a secret I've been hiding from the world." Ilara's breath caught, her heart racing at the implication behind his words. "Chaol, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that these weeks with you have shown me something I never expected to find," he said, his gray eyes intense and unwavering. "A connection I can't simply walk away from, no matter how complicated the circumstances. I don't know exactly what shape our future will take, whether the customs of my kingdom will make things easy or difficult, but I know I want you in that future, Ilara, not as a secret, not hidden away, as someone the entire kingdom will come to know and respect." Tears gathered in her eyes, overwhelmed by the sincerity behind his words, and though caution urged restraint, she found herself unable to hold back the truth of her own feelings any longer. "I want that too," she whispered, "more than I know how to express." Chaol's expression softened into something achingly tender, and he lifted his free hand to gently brush a tear from her cheek. "Then hold on to that hope while I'm gone," he said. "Whatever happens in the days ahead, whatever battles I face, that hope will carry me through." They sat together in comfortable silence for a long while after that, simply holding hands by the firelight, memorizing the quiet comfort of each other's presence before the coming separation. Eventually, exhaustion pulled at them both, and Chaol rose reluctantly, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead, before retreating to the small bed she had insisted he continue using despite his full recovery. Ilara did not sleep well that night, her mind cycling through worry for his safety, hope for the future he had promised, and a quiet ache at the thought of the empty cottage she would return to once he departed. When dawn finally broke, gray and cool through her shuttered window, she rose to find Chaol already awake, dressed in clothing she had carefully mended from what remained of his original garments, looking every bit the formidable king he claimed to be, despite the simple fabric. "It's time," he said quietly, watching her cross the room toward him. "I know," she said, though the words felt heavy in her throat. He pulled her into an embrace, and she pressed her face against his chest, memorizing the steady beat of his heart, the warmth of his arms around her, the quiet strength that had first drawn her to save him weeks ago. "I'll come back for you," he murmured against her hair, "or I'll send word the moment it's safe. I promise you, Ilara, this is not the end of what we've found together." "Be careful," she whispered. "Please." "I will." He pulled back slightly, cupping her face gently between his hands, his gray eyes searching hers with an intensity that stole her breath. "Thank you for saving my life. Thank you for trusting me, even when I couldn't tell you the whole truth. And thank you, most of all, for showing me what it means to be cared for, simply because someone chooses to care, not because of a crown or a title." Before she could respond, he leaned down and kissed her, soft and lingering, a promise pressed between them, without need for further words. When he finally pulled away, his forehead resting against hers, neither of them moved for a long moment, reluctant to break the fragile peace of their final moment together. "Go," she finally whispered, though every instinct urged her to pull him back into the cottage and keep him safe within its walls forever. "Reclaim what's yours. And then come back for me." He nodded once, pressed one final kiss to her forehead, and stepped back, moving toward the door with the careful, controlled grace she had come to recognize as entirely his own. At the threshold, he paused, glancing back at her one last time. "I meant every word, Ilara," he said quietly. "Everything I promised, everything I feel. None of it was born from gratitude alone. Remember that, whatever happens next." Then he was gone, disappearing into the early morning mist that clung to the forest edge, moving with a purpose and confidence that spoke of a man fully restored to his true strength. Ilara stood in the doorway long after he vanished from sight, watching the empty space where he had been, her chest aching, with a combination of hope and fear, so intertwined she could not separate one from the other. She did not know, as she finally closed the door and returned to her now quiet, empty cottage, that the journey ahead of Chaol would prove far more dangerous than either of them had anticipated. Garrick's search parties covered wider territory now, growing increasingly desperate to either confirm the king's death or eliminate him entirely should he prove to still be alive, and word of increased search efforts along the northern trails had reached even the trader's most cautious informants. Cale moved through the forest with careful precision, staying low, avoiding the main paths where searching soldiers were most likely to patrol, relying on years of training and intimate knowledge of the terrain to guide him toward the hidden entrance to his kingdom, a passage known only to the royal family and their most trusted guard. The journey would take the better part of 2 days on foot, longer than he wished given the urgency of the situation, but rushing carelessly risked discovery, and discovery before he reached his allies would mean certain death. As he moved, his thoughts remained anchored to Alara, to the promise he had made, and fully intended to keep, to the quiet cottage that had become, in the span of just a few weeks, more of a true home than the grand halls of his own kingdom had felt in years. Whatever battles awaited him in reclaiming his throne, he carried with him now a reason beyond duty alone, a personal stake in victory that strengthened his resolve with every careful step through the shadowed forest. Behind him, in the small cottage at the edge of Draymore, Ilara returned to her daily routines, though the quiet emptiness of the space where Cale had recently occupied left an ache she could not fully shake. She busied herself with chores, with tending her herb garden, with the small tasks that had once filled her days, before a wounded stranger crashed into her quiet existence, but her thoughts remained constantly with him, wondering where he was, whether he was safe, whether the promise he had made would truly hold against whatever challenges awaited him in the days ahead. She did not know that within his own kingdom, whispers had already begun to circulate among loyal soldiers and suspicious council members, whispers of strange tracks discovered near a small village, whispers that might, if followed carefully enough, eventually lead searching eyes directly to her door. For now, though, she remained safely hidden, her secret intact, her heart anchored to a promise made in the quiet hours before dawn, waiting with cautious hope for whatever news the coming days would bring. Cale reached the hidden entrance to his kingdom as dusk settled over the hills on the second day of his journey, exhausted but unharmed, having avoided every search party through careful navigation and years of ingrained instinct for the terrain. The entrance itself appeared as nothing more than a narrow crack between two ancient boulders, invisible to anyone who did not know the specific angle required to find the passage hidden behind the stone. He slipped through the narrow gap and emerged into the concealed valley beyond, where the great stone city of his kingdom rose from the hillside, carved architecture blending seamlessly with the natural rock formations that had sheltered his people for countless generations. The sight of home after weeks away struck him with unexpected emotion, gratitude, and determination mixing together as he took in the familiar towers and winding streets he had feared he might never see again. He did not go directly to the palace. Instead, he made his way to a modest home near the outskirts of the city, the residence of Captain Ronan, the one man he trusted absolutely to have remained loyal throughout whatever chaos had unfolded in his absence. He arrived at the door, as full darkness fell, knocking with a specific pattern only Ronan would recognize as significant. The door opened, and Ronan's weathered face went through a rapid series of expressions, shock giving way to disbelief, then finally to overwhelming relief as he recognized his king standing very much alive on his doorstep. "Your Majesty," he breathed, immediately pulling Cale inside and glancing quickly up and down the street to ensure no one had witnessed the exchange. "We feared the worst. We searched everywhere." "I know," Cale said, exhaustion evident in his voice now that the immediate danger of exposure had passed. "I need to know everything that's happened since the attack. Every detail, Ronan. My life and the kingdom's stability depend on what you can tell me." Ronan ushered him to a chair by the fire and quickly relayed everything that had transpired, the ambush that had separated Cale from his guard, the reassignment of loyal soldiers just before the attack occurred, Garrick's increasingly bold moves within the council to establish himself as temporary leader while search efforts quietly shifted from rescue to confirmation of death. "Garrick has been careful," Ronan continued, "but not careful enough. Bramwell and I have gathered evidence suggesting he orchestrated the entire attack, hoping to eliminate you and seize control through manipulation of the council, rather than open rebellion. If we move quickly, with proof in hand, we can expose him before he solidifies his position further." Cale listened with growing anger, his hands clenching into fists as the full scope of the betrayal became clear. "Where is he now?" At the palace, presiding over council sessions as though the throne were already his, Ronan said grimly, "He's grown bold, Your Majesty. Bold enough that I worry he may attempt something drastic if he senses his position threatened." "Then we move tonight," Cale said, rising from his chair despite his fatigue, purpose burning away the exhaustion of his journey. "Gather Bramwell, and any other council members you trust absolutely. I want to reclaim my throne before Garrick has any warning that I've returned." Ronan nodded sharply, already moving toward the door to begin summoning trusted allies. Within the hour, a small group had gathered in his home, Bramwell among them, her relief at seeing her king alive, evident despite her composed exterior, along with 3 other council members, whose loyalty Ronan vouched for without hesitation. They spent the remaining hours before dawn, planning carefully, reviewing every piece of evidence Ronan and Bramwell had gathered against Garrick, coordinating the movements of loyal guards, who would need to secure the palace the moment their king made his presence known. Cale listened, questioned, and adjusted their strategy with the sharp, decisive thinking that had made him a respected ruler, even before this crisis tested his leadership so severely. "We need this to be public," he said finally, as their planning session drew to a close. "If I simply reclaim the throne quietly, Garrick's supporters within the council might argue the transition was illegitimate, might continue sowing doubt and division. I want the entire council, the entire court, to witness my return, and understand beyond any doubt what Garrick attempted to do. A public confrontation carries risk," Bramwell warned. "If Garrick has allies among the guards stationed at the palace, a public scene could turn violent quickly." "I'm aware of the risk," Cale said, "but the alternative, allowing uncertainty and division to fester within the council, poses a far greater long-term danger to the kingdom's stability. We do this publicly, with proof of Garrick's betrayal laid bare before witnesses who cannot later claim ignorance or doubt." The group reluctantly agreed, spending the remaining hours refining security measures to minimize the risk of violence during the confrontation. As dawn approached, Cale allowed himself a brief moment of rest, though sleep proved elusive, his mind cycling between the confrontation awaiting him and thoughts of Alara, wondering if she was safe, if she understood how deeply he already missed her presence, despite the short time since their parting. The council convened at midday, unaware of the storm about to break over their carefully constructed narrative of a missing, presumed dead king. Garrick sat in the high seat, addressing the assembled members with his usual practiced confidence, discussing further measures to formalize temporary leadership arrangements that would, in truth, cement his growing control over the kingdom's affairs. He was mid-sentence, outlining proposed changes to trade agreements that conveniently benefited his own allies, when the great doors at the end of the hall swung open with deliberate force, and Cale strode into the chamber, flanked by Ronan and a contingent of loyal guards, his presence commanding immediate, stunned silence from every corner of the room. Garrick's face drained of color, his composed facade cracking for just a moment, before he forced his expression back into careful neutrality. "Your Majesty," he said, rising slowly from the high seat, his voice carrying a note of forced surprise. "We feared you had perished. This is a tremendous relief." "Is it?" Cale asked, his voice cold and carrying easily through the silent hall as he approached the raised platform, where the throne sat empty behind Garrick's retreating form. "Because from where I stand, it appears you've spent considerable effort ensuring my death would be accepted as fact, rather than continuing to search for evidence of my survival." Murmurs rippled through the gathered council, uncertainty and shock evident on many faces as they processed the implications behind their king's pointed words. Garrick attempted to recover his composure, spreading his hands in a gesture of innocent confusion. "Your Majesty, I don't understand your implication. We searched extensively, I assure you, hoping desperately for your safe return." "Did you?" Cale said flatly, gesturing for Ronan to step forward. "Perhaps you can explain, then, why the guards assigned to my personal escort on the day of the attack were reassigned at the last moment, replaced by soldiers loyal specifically to your faction, guards who conveniently failed to notice or respond to an ambush that nearly claimed my life." Garrick's confidence faltered visibly now, his eyes darting toward the gathered council members, as though searching for allies who might defend him, finding instead expressions ranging from suspicion to open hostility. as Ronan began presenting the evidence they had carefully gathered during the weeks of Cale's absence. Documentation of the guard reassignments. Testimony from soldiers who had witnessed Garrick's private meetings with known mercenaries in the days before the ambush occurred. Financial records revealing payments made to individuals with no legitimate connection to the Crown's business. "This is fabrication," Garrick protested, though the desperation creeping into his voice undermined the claim's credibility. "A conspiracy against me, by those who resent my efforts to stabilize the kingdom during a genuine crisis." "Enough," Fiel said, his voice carrying such absolute authority that the hall fell into immediate, complete silence. "I nearly died in that forest, Garrick. I spent weeks recovering from wounds, inflicted by an ambush you orchestrated, hidden away, unable to protect my kingdom from your growing ambition, while you sat in my throne and prepared to formalize a betrayal, decades in the making." He mounted the platform steps, and Garrick, recognizing the futility of further denial, made one desperate move, lunging toward a hidden blade concealed beneath his robes. But Ronan had anticipated exactly this possibility, moving swiftly to intercept the attack before it could reach its intended target, and within moments, loyal guards had subdued Garrick entirely, stripping away his final pretense of innocence. "Take him to the holding chambers," Cale commanded, his voice steady despite the violence of the moment. "He will face full judgment before this council, once all evidence has been properly presented, and his co-conspirators identified." As guards dragged the struggling, protesting Garrick from the hall, Cale turned to face the stunned council, his presence commanding and absolute despite the exhaustion still lingering from his long recovery and dangerous journey home. "I am your king," he said, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the silent chamber. "I did not perish in that forest, and I will not allow this kingdom to fall into the hands of those who would betray it for their own ambition. Order will be restored, and those who conspired against the crown will face full accountability for their actions." The hall erupted into a mixture of relieved cheering and stunned murmuring as the reality of their king's return and Garrick's exposed betrayal settled over the gathered council. Cale allowed himself a moment to simply stand there, absorbing the weight of what had just been accomplished, the throne finally secured, his kingdom's stability restored after weeks of dangerous uncertainty. But even as relief washed through him, his thoughts turned immediately to Alara, to the promise he had made before leaving her cottage, and the realization that he could now, finally, begin the process of bringing her fully into his life, no longer hidden, no longer a secret kept from a world that would soon come to know exactly how much she meant to their king. In the days following Garrick's exposure and arrest, Cale worked tirelessly to restore full order to his kingdom, meeting with council members to reaffirm loyalties, reviewing evidence against Garrick's co-conspirators, and addressing the concerns of citizens unsettled by weeks of uncertainty regarding their king's fate. Sleep came in short, insufficient bursts, and meals were often forgotten entirely, as the weight of restoring stability consumed nearly every waking moment. Yet even amid the overwhelming demands of reclaiming his throne, thoughts of Alara remained constant, a quiet anchor beneath the chaos of his responsibilities. Each evening, no matter how exhausted, he found himself thinking of her small cottage, her gentle hands tending his wounds, the warmth of her laughter, the promise he had made before leaving her behind in Draymore. Bramwell noticed his distraction during a late council session nearly a week after his return, catching him staring absently toward the window rather than fully attending to the discussion of trade agreements requiring his approval. She waited until the session concluded and the other council members had filed out before approaching him privately. "Your Majesty," she said carefully, "forgive my boldness, but something weighs on you beyond the burdens of restoring order. Might I ask what troubles you?" Cale considered deflecting the question, but exhaustion and the genuine trust he held for Bramwell's judgment led him instead toward honesty. "There's someone," he admitted, "a woman who saved my life during my recovery, who cared for me without knowing who I was, who I promised to bring properly into my life once the throne was secured." Bramwell's expression softened with understanding. "And you're troubled by how to fulfill that promise while managing the ongoing demands of restoring your kingdom's stability." "Partly," he admitted. "But more than that, I'm troubled by concern for her safety. Garrick's co-conspirators haven't all been identified yet. If word spreads that a woman in a small village near the forest was responsible for hiding and healing me during my absence, She could become a target for anyone still loyal to Garrick's cause, anyone seeking revenge or leverage against the crown. Then, perhaps, Bramwell said thoughtfully, the solution is not delay, but decisive action. Bring her here, under proper guard and protection, before word of her role in your survival can spread beyond your control. The longer she remains isolated and vulnerable in that village, the greater the risk to her safety. Cale considered this advice carefully, recognizing the wisdom in it, despite his earlier instinct to wait until every threat had been fully neutralized before drawing Alara into his world. Waiting, he realized, might actually increase her danger rather than protect her from it, leaving her exposed and unguarded while he remained focused on kingdom affairs far from Draymore. You're right, he said finally. I need to send for her immediately, and I need to ensure her journey here is conducted with absolute discretion and security. That very evening, he summoned Ronan and outlined his plan, insisting on personally overseeing every detail of the arrangements to ensure Alara's safe and swift arrival at the palace. Ronan listened carefully, offering suggestions to strengthen the security measures, and by the following morning, a small, carefully selected escort of the most trusted guards prepared to depart for Draymore, carrying with them a personal letter from Cale, explaining the summons and reaffirming every promise he had made before leaving her cottage. Word of the king's intentions, however, did not remain entirely contained within the small circle of trusted advisors who helped arrange the mission. Court gossip moved quickly through the palace corridors, and within days, whispers had begun circulating regarding a mysterious woman connected to the king's survival, a healer from a village at the forest's edge who had apparently captured more than simple gratitude from their monarch. The whispers reached far beyond the palace walls faster than Cale anticipated, carried by servants, by council members' households, by merchants who traded regularly between the hidden kingdom and settlements bordering the forest. Within a week, the story had transformed and grown with each retelling, until it reached ears throughout the wider region, painting a romantic picture of a king who had fallen for the humble woman who saved his life, a king now determined to find her and bring her home, no matter the cost. Some among the nobility received this news with genuine warmth, charmed by the romantic nature of the tale, and curious to meet the woman who had captured their king's heart under such extraordinary circumstances. Others, particularly those who had hoped to see their own daughters or sisters considered as potential matches for the unmarried king, received the news with considerably less enthusiasm, viewing the mysterious healer as an unwelcome complication to ambitions they had long nurtured. Cale remained largely unaware of how quickly and widely the story had spread, focused entirely on ensuring the small escort party reached Draymore safely, and returned with Alara before any lingering danger from Garrick's remaining allies could threaten her. He paced restlessly through the palace corridors during the days the mission required, distracted and anxious, in ways that did not escape the notice of those closest to him. You're worried, Ronan observed, finding him standing at a window overlooking the road that led toward the forest's edge, watching for any sign of the returning party days before their expected arrival. I sent guards to bring her here, but I couldn't go myself, Cale admitted, frustration evident in his voice. The council still requires my presence to finalize matters related to Garrick's punishment and the restructuring necessary to prevent future betrayals. I hate that I couldn't be the one to explain everything to her directly, to reassure her that this summons comes from genuine care rather than mere obligation. She'll understand, Ronan said, offering what reassurance he could. You explained everything clearly in your letter, and the guards I selected for this mission are trustworthy, capable of ensuring her comfort and safety throughout the journey. Cale nodded, though the worry did not fully ease. He knew Alara's independent nature, her stubborn insistence on handling difficulties herself, rather than relying entirely on others. He hoped desperately that she would trust the letter he sent, trust the promise he had made, and allow the guards to escort her safely to the kingdom, rather than resisting or attempting some independent action that might place her in greater danger. Meanwhile, in Draymore, Alara had spent the days since Cale's departure caught between hope and anxiety, her thoughts constantly returning to wonder about his safety, about whether his confrontation with the traitors who sought his throne had succeeded, about whether the promise he made before leaving would ultimately prove true or simply fade, once the demands of ruling a kingdom reasserted themselves over whatever connection had grown between them during his recovery. She continued her daily routines as best she could, though Mira noticed her continued distraction during their occasional visits. Gently probing without pushing too hard for answers, Elara still could not fully provide. The village itself remained blissfully unaware of the dramatic events unfolding within the hidden kingdom beyond the forest, its residents continuing their simple lives without any indication that their quiet healer had become unwittingly entangled in matters of crowns and betrayal. It was nearly 2 weeks after Kale's departure when Elara first noticed unusual activity at the edge of the village. A small group of finely dressed strangers making inquiries among the local residents, their careful, respectful manner immediately distinguishing them from the rough soldiers who had previously searched the surrounding forest. Word spread quickly through Draymore's tight-knit community, curiosity and speculation building, as villagers wondered what business brought such obviously important visitors to their humble settlement. Elara's heart began racing the moment she heard the descriptions circulating through the village, finely armored guards asking specifically after a healer living at the forest's edge, carrying with them a sealed letter bearing an unfamiliar royal crest. She barely dared to hope as she made her way toward the village center, her steps quickening despite the anxious uncertainty churning in her stomach. The lead guard, a stern but respectful woman named Elowin, approached her the moment their eyes met, some instinct apparently confirming her identity before words were even exchanged. "You would be Elara," she said, her tone carrying genuine deference rather than mere formality. "We come on behalf of King Kale of the Northlands, bearing a personal message and an invitation to accompany us to the royal palace." Elara's breath caught, relief and joy flooding through her chest at the confirmation that Kale had survived, that his confrontation with the traitors had apparently succeeded, that he had kept his promise, despite the demands surely weighing on him during his return to power. "He's safe," she said, more statement than question, though the words still trembled with hopeful uncertainty. "Very much so," Elowin confirmed, a small, understanding smile crossing her otherwise composed features as she extended a sealed letter toward Elara. "His Majesty reclaimed his throne successfully, and has spoken of little else besides ensuring your safe passage to join him. Perhaps his own words will explain the situation more thoroughly than I can." With trembling hands, Elara broke the seal and unfolded the letter, immediately recognizing Kale's careful handwriting as she began to read, her eyes filling with tears as his words confirmed every promise he had made during their final morning together, along with detailed explanations of the danger she might face remaining isolated in Draymore, now that whispers of her role in his survival had begun spreading beyond his control. As she finished reading, gathering herself before the small crowd of curious villagers who had begun gathering to witness this unprecedented visitation, Elara felt the full weight of the moment settling over her, the quiet, simple life she had known in Draymore, about to transform entirely into something far grander and far more uncertain than anything she had previously imagined for herself. The journey from Draymore to the Hidden Kingdom took 2 full days, traveling by carriage along paths Elara had never known existed, winding through sections of the forest that seemed to shift and blur in ways her ordinary senses struggled to fully comprehend. Elowin explained, during quiet moments of conversation along the route, that the kingdom's protective boundaries worked to confuse and redirect those without proper guidance, an ancient safeguard that had kept the hidden realm secure for countless generations. Elara listened with fascination, her earlier anxiety gradually giving way to genuine wonder as the carriage finally passed through the concealed entrance Kale had once described during their quiet evenings by the fire, revealing the breathtaking valley beyond, stone towers rising gracefully from the hillside, streets bustling with people who moved with an energy and vitality that spoke of a community fully returned to stability after weeks of uncertain leadership. The carriage drew considerable attention as it wound through the city streets toward the palace, curious onlookers gathering along the route, having clearly heard whispers regarding the king's summons, and eager to catch a glimpse of the woman at the center of such an unusual romantic tale. Elara felt the weight of their attention keenly, self-conscious in her simple traveling clothes amid a city clearly accustomed to far grander displays. Kale was waiting at the palace entrance when the carriage finally arrived, having abandoned any pretense of formal composure the moment word reached him that Elowin's party had entered the city. He crossed the courtyard the instant the carriage door opened, his expression a mixture of relief, joy, and barely contained emotion, as Elara stepped down, and their eyes met for the first time in nearly 3 weeks. "You came," he said softly, closing the remaining distance between them. "Of course I came," she replied, her voice catching as months of worry and hope finally found release. "You promised, and I believed you." He pulled her into an embrace right there in the courtyard, heedless of the many watching eyes, and Alara felt every lingering doubt and anxiety of the past weeks finally dissolve in the warmth of his arms. When he finally pulled back enough to look at her properly, his gray eyes searched her face with an intensity that spoke volumes beyond mere words. "I've missed you more than I can properly express," he murmured. "Every day since I left, I thought of you, wondering if you were safe, hoping desperately that the promise I made hadn't come too late. I'm here now," she said softly. "That's what matters." He led her into the palace, past curious servants and courtiers who watched with open interest, offering brief introductions and explanations as they moved through the grand corridors toward private chambers, where they could finally speak freely, without the weight of so many watching eyes. Once the door closed behind them, sealing them into blessed privacy, Kale pulled her close once more, resting his forehead against hers. "There's so much I need to explain," he said. "About the kingdom, about what happened with Garrick, about what your presence here means for both of us moving forward. But first, I simply need this moment, to know you're truly here, safe and whole." Alara relaxed into his embrace, allowing herself finally to fully believe that everything he had promised was genuinely coming to pass. "Tell me everything," she said. "I want to understand all of it." Over the following hours, Kale explained the full scope of what had transpired since his return: Garrick's exposure and arrest, the ongoing process of identifying and addressing his remaining co-conspirators, the restoration of stability throughout the council and kingdom. He explained, too, the whispers that had spread regarding her role in his survival, whispers that had grown into something of a legend among his people, painting their story with romantic significance that neither of them had anticipated. "Some among the nobility aren't entirely pleased," he admitted honestly, unwilling to hide difficult truths from her now that she had fully entered this new world. "There are those who hoped for different arrangements, who view your humble origins as unsuitable for someone standing beside the throne. I won't pretend that challenge doesn't exist." "I'm not afraid of that," Alara said, though a flicker of uncertainty crossed her expression despite her confident words. "But I won't pretend it doesn't concern me either. I'm a healer's granddaughter from a small village, Kale. I don't know the first thing about courts, about politics, about everything that comes with standing beside a king. You'll learn," he said gently, taking her hands in his. "And you won't learn it alone. I intend to stand beside you through every challenge this transition brings, and anyone who questions your worth will answer directly to me." His expression softened further, something achingly sincere entering his gaze. "But more than that, Alara, I don't want you to change who you are, to fit expectations that were never fair to begin with. The qualities that drew me to you in the first place, your kindness, your courage, your refusal to abandon someone in need regardless of personal risk, those qualities are exactly what this kingdom needs in someone who might one day stand as its queen." The word hung in the air between them, heavier and more significant than anything spoken during their weeks together in the small cottage. Alara's breath caught, searching his face for confirmation that she had understood correctly. "Queen," she repeated softly. Kale sank slowly to one knee before her, producing from within his jacket a ring, unlike anything she had ever seen. Silver metal wrapped delicately around a stone that seemed to catch and hold the light of the room in shifting, luminous patterns. "Alara," he said, his voice steady despite the vulnerability evident in his expression. "I know this is faster than perhaps custom typically allows, and I know the road ahead will bring challenges neither of us can fully anticipate, but I've never been more certain of anything than I am of this. You saved my life when you owed me nothing, cared for me without expectation of reward, and showed me what it means to be valued, simply for who I am, rather than the title I carry. I love you, completely and without reservation, and I want nothing more than to build a future together, as partners equal in every sense that matters. Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife, and standing beside me as queen of this kingdom?" Tears streamed freely down Alara's face now, overwhelming joy mixing with the weight of everything this moment represented, the transformation of her quiet, simple life into something she had never dared imagine for herself. "Yes," she whispered, then repeated it more firmly as he rose to slip the ring onto her finger. Yes, Kale, 1,000 times yes. He kissed her then, deep and full of promise, sealing the commitment they had just made to each other, with a certainty that erased any lingering doubt about the path forward. When they finally parted, both breathless and smiling through Alara's happy tears, Kale rested his forehead against hers once more. We have challenges ahead, he acknowledged softly. Skeptical nobles, unfamiliar customs, the ongoing work of fully securing the kingdom against any remaining threats. But we'll face all of it together, exactly as we should. Together, Alara agreed, and the word carried a weight of promise that neither of them intended to break. News of the king's engagement spread through the kingdom within days, carried by servants and courtiers who had witnessed the couple's evident devotion during the weeks that followed Alara's arrival at the palace. The romantic tale, already popular among common folk who found the story of a humble healer capturing their king's heart deeply appealing, only grew more beloved as details of the proposal became known. Not everyone within the palace received the news with equal enthusiasm. Among the council members who had hoped to see their own families connected to the throne through more traditional arrangements, quiet murmurs of disapproval circulated in private conversations, questions raised about Alara's suitability for a role that carried such significant responsibility and public visibility. Kale addressed these concerns directly, calling a formal council session shortly after the engagement was announced, standing before the assembled members with Alara at his side, her chin lifted with quiet determination despite the obvious nervousness she carried into the confrontation. I understand some among you harbor doubts, Kale said, his voice carrying the same commanding authority that had reclaimed his throne from Garrick's betrayal. Doubts about Alara's background, her preparation for the responsibilities she will assume as queen. I ask that you set aside those doubts, and instead, consider the qualities that actually matter in someone who will stand beside this throne. He turned to Alara, gesturing for her to step forward, and though her nervousness remained evident, she straightened her shoulders and addressed the council with a steadiness that surprised even herself. I know I don't come from noble birth, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber. I know the customs and expectations of this court are unfamiliar to me, and I know it will take time for me to fully understand everything required of this role. But I also know what it means to care for people, to work hard, to face difficult circumstances without abandoning what matters most. I found your king dying in a forest and chose to save him without knowing who he was, simply because it was the right thing to do. I intend to bring that same commitment to caring for this kingdom's people, if you'll allow me the chance to prove myself worthy of your trust. A long silence followed her words, the council members exchanging glances as they weighed her sincerity against their initial reservations. Finally, Bramwell rose from her seat, her expression thoughtful as she addressed the gathered assembly. I have served this crown for many years, she said, and I have seen many who sought this position for reasons of ambition or status, rather than genuine care for the people they would serve. What I hear in Lady Alara's words is something different, a sincerity that speaks well of the choice our king has made. I, for one, offer my full support. Her endorsement carried significant weight among the council, and gradually, one by one, other members voiced their own tentative or wholehearted approval, until the initial resistance had largely dissolved into cautious acceptance, if not yet complete enthusiasm. Kale squeezed Alara's hand gently, pride evident in his expression, as she navigated the challenge with grace and honesty, rather than pretense or false confidence. In the weeks that followed, Alara threw herself into learning everything necessary to prepare for her new role, studying court customs and kingdom history, with the same dedication she had once applied to learning healing arts from her grandmother. She continued practicing her healing skills as well, insisting on maintaining a small clinic within the palace grounds, where she could offer care to those in need, a choice that quickly endeared her to common folk throughout the kingdom, who found comfort in a future queen, who remained genuinely connected to their everyday struggles. Kale watched her transformation with growing admiration, though he was careful never to let the demands of her new education overshadow the qualities that had first drawn him to her in that small cottage at Draymore's Edge. Their evenings together remained precious, quiet moments away from the formal demands of court life, where they could simply be Kale and Alara rather than king and future queen, laughing together over shared meals, discussing hopes for the future they were building together. The wedding itself, when it finally arrived several months later, brought the entire kingdom together in celebration, unlike anything the Hidden Realm had witnessed in generations. The great hall where Chaol had once confronted Garrick's betrayal now overflowed with flowers and warm light, transformed for an occasion of joy rather than crisis, filled with nobles and common folk alike who had come to witness the union of their king and the woman who had saved his life, and, in doing so, saved the kingdom itself from falling into the hands of those who sought to exploit it for their own gain. Elara stood at the entrance of the great hall, dressed in flowing fabric that caught the light with every movement, her heart racing with a combination of nervousness and overwhelming joy as she prepared to walk toward the man who had transformed her quiet, simple life into something she had never dared imagine for herself. Mira stood beside her, having traveled from Draymore for the occasion, tears of happiness streaming freely as she squeezed her old friend's hand. "I can hardly believe this is really happening," Mira whispered. "My closest friend, about to become queen of a hidden kingdom." "Neither can I, if I'm honest," Elara admitted, a nervous laugh escaping her. "But I've never felt more certain of anything in my life." The music began, and Elara stepped forward into the great hall, every eye turning toward her as she walked the long aisle toward the platform where Chaol waited, dressed in formal attire that could not entirely disguise the same wounded, grateful man she had first found dying in a forest creek months earlier. His expression, as their eyes met across the crowded hall, held such open, undisguised love that any remaining nervousness dissolved entirely, replaced by pure, certain joy. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of formal words and meaningful traditions, ancient rituals of the Hidden Kingdom, blending with promises Elara recognized from her own village customs, a fitting symbol of the union between two different worlds now joined together through their shared commitment. When Chaol finally slipped a second ring alongside the engagement ring she already wore, sealing their marriage before the assembled witnesses, the great hall erupted into celebration, cheers and applause echoing off ancient stone walls that had witnessed countless generations of the kingdom's history. "You are now, officially and completely, my queen," Chaol murmured, pulling her close as the celebration continued around them. The healer who saved a dying king, now standing as ruler beside him. "And you," Elara replied, smiling up at him with a happiness that filled every corner of her being, "are the man who ordered an entire kingdom searched just to find one healer from a small forest village." "I would have searched forever, if that's what it took," he said softly, his gray eyes holding hers with the same intensity that had first captured her heart during those quiet weeks of his recovery. "You saved me in every way a person can be saved, Elara. Body, and afterward heart. I intend to spend the rest of my life ensuring you never regret the choice you made that night in the forest." Outside the great hall, throughout the hidden valley and the surrounding hills, the kingdom celebrated the union of their king and his unexpected queen, a story that would be told and retold for generations to come, of a dying man, rescued in secret by a healer who asked for nothing in return, and a king whose gratitude transformed into a love strong enough to reshape an entire kingdom's future. Whatever challenges still lay ahead, whatever adjustments and growth their new life together would require, Elara and Chaol faced them now as true partners, bound together by a bond, forged first in desperate need, and later, in a love neither had expected, but both had come to cherish beyond measure. The forest that had once nearly claimed Chaol's life now stood simply as the place where his true story began, the quiet cottage at its edge, forever remembered as the humble setting where a king found not just healing for his wounds, but the woman who would stand beside him for the rest of his days, transforming both of their lives in ways neither could have imagined on that dark, desperate night when a scream had first pierced the silence of the woods.